Vedanta, Chittamatra, and Prasangika Madhyamaka. These are the three philosophies of reality which are strongly compatible with the data from quantum mechanics. And I have friends still in Switzerland who are working physicists. Then this is what they are interested in. This makes sense. Does that answer your question?
The third question I have is a bit tongue-in-cheek. I'd love to hear your comment on the strong levels of altruism in a bull ant versus that of an academic who's scared of losing tenure.
Yeah, what does it say?
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
There was a documentary I saw a while ago. It was, let me just read my notes here. It talked about some research that was done on quantum entanglement, where scientists used people's, they plugged people's hearts up to monitors and printed out I'm not sure what they're called, but the heart monitor.
ECG.
ECG, yeah. And they were told both good and bad news, and they noticed that in between the spikes of the heart, that depending upon the news that they were giving the pupils, that there were different, I'm not sure what you call them, but responses between the spikes. So I was just wondering if you think that there is a connection between quantum entanglement, ESP, and that whole, the physical form responding to that, I guess.
I can't say normally. The moment you pass above pretty much the molecular level, quantum phenomena normally no longer are operative. You have domestic coherence. Then, in that case, I don't know.
So the heart responded before it actually heard the news. That was the interesting thing about it, that it was able to pick up the news before it was actually told.
That's interesting. You'd have to exclude a lot of other things, obviously. You'd have to see how the experiment was done. You'd have to exclude unintentional cues from the experiment. It's very difficult to do. Then if the experiment was well devised, it could be an indication of precognition, yes. But unintentional cues is very difficult to eliminate.
Do you think it's possible that the body can respond in a physical way before it actually hears what that is?
It could be. I have known many cases of precognition during my life, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build a very strong rational case. Then your experiences, you have to make them yourselves. But there is a strong rational case to be made. I think research in this field is really important. Then I was telling Chris a couple of days ago that I'm more optimistic about clinical research, for instance on near-death experience and academic research, because clinical research is more grounded in clinical reality. And clinicists typically are not in this, I suppose, you can call it the dog milieu of academia, and have a bit more independence. Certainly as far as near-death experiences are concerned, we get some strong research from clinicians, and the academics have a much harder time finding funding. So I was looking at the cat behind you, she's just trying to come in. Do we have any questions?
Thank you very much. I've read some historical accounts of Tibetans and so on, and they seem to have a high incidence of these psychic abilities. The messages on the wind and their ability to dream and in a precognitive way and so on. So it seems they're highly receptive recipients to messages, possibly. The other question is, if they are highly receptive, recipients and good at receiving messages. They also generate altruism and engage in the thinking of the suffering of others on a huge scale. Yet, they do not seem to be affected by the suffering of others. So the greater their empathy increases, the less they seem afflicted by suffering. If they are really in tune to the sentient beings around them, what kind of thing would explain that phenomenon if it is true?
What would explain them not being affected by the suffering of others?
Yes, even though they're able to connect with the minds of others and figure out, well, I assume that they connect to the minds of others and that's how they know a certain thing is going to happen or a certain being's continuum is right or so on. I assume they have those intuitive abilities. But yeah, they don't seem to be affected in a really negative way, no matter the empathy they generate for other sentient beings.
Well, we're shifting here from, I think, the realm of science to that of Buddhist philosophy, but in Buddhist philosophy, come here, in the realm of Buddhist philosophy, clearly one's karma is private. Then one's suffering is a result of one's own karma. Another cannot experience it for oneself, however much they would wish to. Then how
But
one
another can experience the mental image that someone else is transmitting. So it seems strange they wouldn't experience their emotions as well.
I'm sure they perceive their emotions, but they don't experience them. How one's mind appears to someone who has telepathy is a bit of an open question. I mean, telepathy is, I would say, current. Quite widespread with the Tibetan monasteries. Many of my teachers had it. I had clear proof really of it. So once they knew that I knew, it was more or less how it worked. Once they knew that I knew, we stopped making believe it didn't happen. Then, I didn't have to explain a lot of things anymore. Made everyone's life a lot simpler. Then until they were sure that I knew and was sure, I was not worried about the whole process, we go through the rigmarole of my explaining things and all that. These phenomena are widely tested in Tibetan monasteries. Telepathy is just current. Memories of past lives, very widespread. Psychokinesis, I know of a couple of cases, much stronger than Jan's territory, much stronger. These tend to occur in controlled environments. I can tell you, for instance, from one case, one of my teachers basically had clear premonitions with the 11th of September.
That I don't dispute. I wonder why, though, the yogi meditating on the suffering of his mother and other mothers does not develop all of those illnesses. Because it's said in the Tibetan tradition, compassion actually can cure illnesses such as leprosy. Yet, seems paradoxical, I suppose. I was wondering if you had a theory of why.
It is said that it is possible if one concentrates on love, so a strong concentration, to experience in one's body the suffering of others. So Maitreya Yogi was said to have those experiences, but obviously one does not have the karma to experience another person's suffering. And what karma is complex. Karma within the arrogance is a compositional factor. Karma is at the interface of one's mind and the reality one experiences. It is something which is very difficult to share. It's impossible to share, actually.
But Stevenson's research suggests many cases where a terrible event happening to a loved one and a simultaneous or very closely related event, for instance, fear or something. I'm not suggesting that the mother who experiences fear when his son dies is actually experiencing his karma, but somehow that whole situation is acting as a condition for her to experience some fear.
Those cases are unknown, and I've known of a couple. I can't really answer your question. I've known at least of one case of a teacher of a friend of mine who was killed, experiencing the fear of death of this friend at the time of his death, some 1,000 and some kilometers away, like a very sharp pain in the breast. Then, obviously he didn't experience death, but there seems to be a mental connection which allows emotions to flow. Certainly the Russian evidence on telepathy, that's why I presented it to you, seems to indicate that the amplifier for telepathic transmission is emotion. And all of the anecdotal evidence for telepathy corroborates that as well. Plus the existence of some type of connection between the parties. Mother and child, friends. More than that we cannot say. Do we have other questions?
I was interested in you saying that at the level of quantum physics, people have vastly different opinions about what it all means. Is that discussed in any papers, or are they holding keeping their powder dry, or are they just exhausted having argued for something?
There's a gentleman's agreement not to talk about it. So it was thrashed out in great details in the 1930s and 40s, with quantum physics becoming ever stranger. And then there really was a gentleman's agreement. That's the best term I can find for it. We're just going to do the math. We go from point A to point B, we get the results. We're not quite sure what the math means when it works. Like if you take a wave function, I'm trying to describe it to you in English, but it's a mathematical reality. It's a long thing you write on the board. And what it means, nobody really knows. Or, if you prefer, everyone has his own opinion. And especially in the last 50 years with Bell's theorem, nobody really knows where Bell's theorem is going to take us. The theorems are not terribly complicated to write, but the verifications of the violations show that Einstein's view of a world in which, as he said, God did not throw dice is fundamentally wrong. And every year which passes with ever more detailed verifications of the violations of Bell's theorems show that we live in a world which is non-local, probably non-deterministic, and probably a world which does not really exist independently of our minds. Now, this is something which the two Mahayana schools of Buddhist philosophy are quite comfortable with, but it is something with which most Westerners are profoundly comfortable with. Most scientists are profoundly comfortable with. That's why it was quite nice to read Richard Kuhn's letter to nature. It's a very, very interesting period, and that's why I wanted to cover with you this morning Thomas Kuhn's analysis of paradigm shift, because I think that is exactly the situation we're in at present. We had a paradigm shift which started in the 1930s. It's been 84 years now. And it's a fundamental paradigm shift from a realistic, deterministic, local universe to a non-realistic, non-deterministic, non-local universe in which mind is non-material. Then it's being resisted very strongly, because you can see why it's being resisted. Like, take something very basic, like the double blind test you may have heard about, right? When you test let's say, a medical compound, you have subjects who receive it and subjects who don't receive it, and nobody knows who's got it or not, right? And then you can eliminate the placebo effect. If the telepathy is a reality, how on earth does a double-blind testing procedure function? It can't. Because it's impossible to preclude the possibility of one of the subjects knowing through telepathy that the other subject has received it and he has not. Or through checking the mind of the experimenter, knowing who got what. Then, much of scientific experimentation as we know it goes out through the windows. So I think the resistance of the working scientists to any change of the paradigm is quite understandable. But certainly in physics, we're being forced in that direction. Yes.
I would have thought the question what it means determines the boundary between science and philosophy, and that's perhaps why scientists don't engage in, or engage less in, what the meaning is of their finding.
Well, that was the position of the founders of quantum mechanics. That was Niels Bohr's position, which is basically we work with the data, we try to construct theories, we stick to the math, and we don't ask too many questions. Then the problem is, more and more, one is dealing with incredibly counterintuitive phenomena, such as tunneling in quantum mechanics, where basically a particle can just pass from one point to the other without seemingly passing in any of the intermediate points. And it's becoming more and more awkward to do the math without any real understanding of what's happening. You've all heard of quantum computers and quantum cryptography, which are basically probably the next step forwards in cybernetics. Then it's quite striking to think that really we have no clear understanding of the theoretical underpinnings of either. The math is understood, empirical data is understood. Why things happen the way they do, we don't understand. So it's very, very awkward to have a situation where you are basically asserting this. This is very strange. When you have, okay, classical Newtonian physics as a subset of relativistic physics or quantum physics, that's okay. But this boundary here, with relativistic physics and quantum physics, this is bizarre. You have one cutting-edge set of physics, especially on general relativity, which is both realistic and local. In other words, the world exists out there, and phenomena to interact must be somewhat close. And you have another cutting-edge field of physics, which is neither realistic nor local. And both work in their respective fields. So it's very odd. It begs the question, well, do we have a super theory, and that's been the holy grail of the last 80 years. There have been numerous attempts. We're trying to find an overarching theory. But what is interesting for us are the consequences of quantum physics. That relativistic physics, especially theory of relativity, basically puts in question our understanding of space and time. This is less relevant for us. It's interesting philosophically, but less relevant. But quantum physics addresses directly the status of the mind. And in so doing, really opens the door to all the great philosophical and religious traditions which assert that the mind is non-Mercurian. If von Neumann's understanding of the status of the observer is confirmed, then we will be able to say that certain philosophical and religious traditions are true and others are false. It's something which is quite unique in human history. Because if von Neumann's understanding is true, then we can say materialism is false. if the developments in understanding the fallacy are true, then we can say realism is false. Then I would say the two pillars of Western philosophy pretty much collapse. So it's a very exciting period to live in. I think it's very distressing for physicists. My impression of biologists is that they leave these questions to the physicists. But it's interesting for us because what we do see at TBI is that our students face a lot of difficulty from these coarse reductionistic models of the human mind, which typically come from neurobiology. So we've lost a couple of students to it. And it's worth pointing out that there is strong evidence that these are the question. We have a question from this lady here, I think.
In the biology of belief by Bruce Lipton, in the documentary The Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton, have you seen that? He's a biologist, he used to genetically engineer muscle cells in petri dishes, and he did it for many years. And while he was doing it, because he was just a straight out scientist, he sort of tripped over belief, because he would do things like take the DNA out of the cell, and yet the cell still functions. So he started to question where the consciousness lay within the cell, and as he took the different parts out of the cell, there was still consciousness within the cell. So it didn't lie within the DNA, and it didn't lie within, and he ends up being incredibly inspired and finding faith from science, funnily enough, because he finds that really all our cells are little antennas, and if they're antennas, and they're picking up transmissions, and where are they picking up transmissions from? So he was a biologist, just that I he did trip over it. He discovered faith through science, which is my personal experience, is pretty rare. And he's a very inspired man. It's a very inspiring two-part documentary. Available on YouTube if you want.
I haven't seen it. So I can't comment.
So I'll tell you, there's one biologist out there.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah.
You touched on quantum physics supporting non-determinism, and I wondered how karma and causality hold up in the face of non-determinism in the quantum world.
We'll talk about it tomorrow.
Okay.
In brief, what I would say is that within the four systems of tenets, Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamika, Vaibhashika and Sautrantika are realistic and strongly deterministic. Then they are not compatible with quantum mechanics. If the evidence really seems to support this at present, quantum mechanics is a definitive description of reality, then there are only two schools of tenets which are compatible, Chittamatra and Madhyamika, actually really Chittamatra and Prasangika. Then the Chittamatra and Prasangika understanding of causality is very complex. It's not at all the straightforward causality you find in Sautrantika. Not at all. Most quantum physicists who are philosophically inclined tend to err towards idealistic systems, like Chittamatra or Vedanta.
Mine was a clarification from this morning. From my perspective, whatever the answer to the question is, empathy is definitely present. But my question is, in this morning's talk, were you asserting that empathy happens as a part of evolution or despite evolution?
Empathy is unnecessary
For evolution.
for evolution. I mean, if we consider that all behaviors certainly all animal behavior with nominal exceptions is transmitted, and you have a large number of sociobiologists who are of this opinion, then empathy is really very difficult to explain. Altruism can be explained in genetically related populations, as I mentioned this morning. But empathy really seems like a case of maladaptation.
So it happens despite evolution.
Yeah.
Evolution would naturally weed out empathy, but yet empathy remains.
Well, there seems to be no evolutionary advantage for an animal which has strong empathy. Like a rat who sees another rat being shocked, the example I gave this morning, would probably not be genetically related to another rat. Then that reaction of strong empathy decreases his own chances of survival and is of no benefit to the rat being shocked. So, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's a net loss. One doesn't see what benefit the rat would derive. In the case of altruism, you can make the case that in closely genetically related populations, an individual who sacrifices himself is nonetheless able to further the transmission of his genes because they be carried by other members of the population. But this case basically collapses when you're dealing with populations which are not genetically related, or very loosely related. And then all altruism, and there are numerous cases in these populations, and primates especially, has to be seen as a case of extreme maladaptation, which amounts to a form of suicide. Darwin is very aware of this, and frankly, altruism has been the stumbling block for all of the theories of evolution up to the modern synthesis from day one. By the way, I do subscribe to the theory of evolution, just to have any doubts. I just don't view it as an all-encompassing theory which accounts for everything. And when it comes to sociobiology, I am much more hesitant. It is clear to me that there is behavior which is transmitted genetically. It's just as clear to me that there is huge swathes of behavior which are culturally acquired, and in my private opinion, which are acquired through incarnation. Then I think some of the aberrant forms of explanation we're dealing with nowadays arise from the fact that we cannot invoke reincarnation as an explanatory model. Things become quite simple if you invoke reincarnation. And if you don't, you have to start stretching and coming up with all sorts of very contrived explanations. Do you have other questions? Then, it's been a very long day. Thank you very much for your attention, especially this afternoon. I hope you can see that there is some method to the madness of these presentations. And then at the end, looking back, there is ground for a rational adherence to some of the Indian schools of thought. And I would like to point out tomorrow that Buddhism is privileged in this respect because key tenets of Buddhist philosophy are fundamentally in harmony with much of what we know now of basic physics. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just to say that Ilia, you've once again given us much food for thought, and we will all be dreaming about this tonight, I'm sure. And so I did forget to thank Susan St. Clair for feeding the body, which has helped us to get through the day. So thank you so much, Susan.